Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon, and it's time once again to take another deep dive into the thriller TV series from the early 1960s, starring your host, Boris Karloff. So, this is a long running series. I'm doing essentially like 6 episodes at a time if you're new here. So, on today's video, we're actually going to be breaking down season 1, episodes 27 through episode 32, rather. So let's get into it. So episode 27 is called Late Date. And this is based on a 1935 Cornell Woolrich story called The Corpse and the Kid, or I've seen it called The Corpse and the Boy also. This episode was actually very darkly hilarious. Not sure if that was intentional or not. It's kind of like a comedy of errors type story, but centered around the many headaches of body disposal. I mean, covering up a murder. It's such a pain in the ass, right? So Herschel Doherty has directing duties this time around again. Like, he also directed episode 17, which was called The Poisoner, episode 20, which was called Hayfork and Billhook. I've talked about those on like my previous videos. And this episode also features a couple of pretty well-known TV actors, I feel like. Larry Pennell, he was Dash Riprock on the Beverly Hillbillies TV series. And Edward Platt, who I guess most people, like, he's kind of best known as being the chief from Get Smart, but I instantly recognized him from the 1959 movie The Rebel Set because I saw it on Mystery Science Theater a bunch of times. So what we have here is Edward Platt's character, whose name is James, and he has just strangled his wife Doris to death, as one does. Like, I guess after an argument, and I guess he didn't really mean it. So he's still like kind of in shock about it. So James's brother Larry actually comes home to their beach house right after the incident took place. And although it immediately seems pretty evident that James didn't really mean to kill Doris, like I said, and he feels really bad about it, Larry kind of tries to calm him down by saying, hey, she was a two-bit floozy anyway, like, who really had it coming, like, she was screwing around on you. And because they're brothers, no way is Larry going to let James take the fall for this. They're gonna cover the shit up. So Larry comes up with a plan, which has to do with the train that James came into town on. It's way too complicated to get into, but it kind of like involves, the specific kind of train ticket, round trip or punch card or whatever, and the day that James would normally be on the train, because I guess he came into town a day early or something like that. It's like I said, it's not really, the details of it really aren't important. So Larry basically tells James, why don't you take the train back to the city, like on the down low, and once you get back to the city, make sure that you're seen by as many people as possible, like your friends and stuff, so everybody will think that you were out and about on the town on Thursday night as you usually would have been, instead of coming to the beach house a day early like you really did, and killed your hussy of a wife. So he's like, so while James is doing all that, Larry says, I will handle getting rid of Doris's body. So James is pretty shell-shocked, so he's just like, okay, fine, and he just skedaddles off to the train station. And then after that, there ensues a very amusingly grim series of events revolving around Larry trying to cover up this murder. Now, while Doris is still sprawled upstairs across the bed, dead, obviously, some other relative or friend or somebody who presumably lives here, and seriously, one thing that I have to say about this episode, maybe I wasn't paying as close attention as I thought, but I'm not real clear on whose house this is, or how all these characters are related to one another, or which ones of them actually live in the house. Like, I'm assuming that Doris and James lived there because they had a bedroom, but some of the other people that come and go, like, seem like they also live there too, so I'm not really sure. Maybe this is just like a beach house that's kind of like kept in, for this whole family, and like they just come down on weekends or whatever, I guess, I'm presuming. So this girl shows up to change clothes, and by the way, she also wants to go into Doris's room to like steal some of her perfume. I think this girl is maybe Doris's stepdaughter, not entirely sure though. So obviously it's not a great idea for her to be going into Doris's room, since Doris is, not really all that alive anymore. Now, Larry tries to thwart her from going into the room by using, like, really the lamest excuses possible, and the poor bastard is just clearly not a criminal mastermind. He just kind of like stutters, and he comes up with all these really painfully contorted justifications about why she can't go in there. And it's really just excruciating to watch because you kind of feel bad for the guy. I mean, he didn't kill the girl, you know what I mean? He killed the woman. So at some point, I'm actually like yelling at the screen. It's like, what are you doing? Have you never seen CSI? It's like, you just like look super guilty right now. Now, he luckily gets saved by yet another random motherfucker, like, showing up at the house and just leaning on the doorbell. I think this might be the stepdaughter's boyfriend, but I'm not entirely sure. And then, like, later on, he actually ends up getting a phone call from Doris's side piece, whose name is Sid. And this phone call actually gives Larry a brilliant idea. He's gonna tell Sid that Doris will meet him later, like, at this downtown club or this place that they always go. So then Larry rolls Doris up in the carpet like a corpse burrito, hefts it out the house, and he says that, oh, I spilled ink on it and I'm going to take it to the cleaners, because the second he rolls up the carpet and like takes it out the house, like literally every motherfucker in the neighborhood, like the neighbor's like, hey, what you doing with that? It's like random motherfuckers, hey, what you doing with that? It's like, holy crap. It's just like, it's really hilarious because it's like, you'd think somebody carrying a carpet out the house, like if I walked down the street and saw a neighbor carrying a carpet out the house, I absolutely would not ask them what the fuck they were doing. And it's just like so funny to me that like every single person is like, hey, what you doing with that? Hey, where are you going? Hey, what is, you know what I mean? Because I kind of feel like that probably wouldn't happen. Most people would be like, oh, they're probably taking it to get cleaned, or they're moving or something like that, and they would just like go about their day. But you know, just for attention purposes, they had to have every single person like wondering what the fuck he was doing. So he's like, what I'm gonna do, you know, Doris in the carpet, I'm gonna take it and I'm going to stuff it in the trunk of Sid's car, like while Sid is parked at the club, like waiting for Doris, who's obviously never going to show up. So during the course of this plan, like a lot of shit goes wrong, and he almost gets caught like a bunch of times, mostly because people just keep randomly coming up and asking him what the fuck he's doing with the carpet. But he eventually does succeed in this convoluted plan. He actually does get the body into the trunk, like without anybody seeing him. When he gets back to the beach house, though, his brother James has already come back. He's like, look, once I came to my senses and I realized what I did, I thought it would be best to like not take the train back to the city, and I'm just going to turn myself into the police because there was really no excuse for me to kill Doris, even if she was a two-bit hoe. And I guess he figures it'll just be second-degree murder, you know what I mean? So, because like I said, he didn't like intend to kill her. It was just like a fight. Now, I thought that the twist of the story was going to be that James had already called the cops and confessed to the murder, like making all of Larry's hilariously like labyrinthine struggles completely pointless. But in a twist of a twist, it actually turns out that Sid, the side piece who had Doris's body in his trunk without him knowing about it, he was mad that Doris hadn't shown up for their appointment or whatever, their date. He drove like an asshole and went careening off into a ravine, and the car caught fire and like it killed him, and it burned Doris's body so much that it was impossible for the police to tell that she'd already been strangled. So the cops actually come to the house to tell James the terrible bad news that his wife has been killed in an accident. So essentially, had they just left it there, Larry and James got away with it. But of course, because evidently we can't have murderers and corpse disposer people getting a free pass for their foul deeds, because, you know, that would be bad. James actually follows the cops when they leave the house, like presumably to tell them to confess like what he did. And Larry's just like, okay, I guess so. So he goes like right behind him, is like, hey, hid the body. You know what I mean? So it was that. Honestly, I kind of think the whole thing would have been better if the guys would have just like, after the cops left, they would have just like high-fived and been like, sweet, we pulled it off, you know, like after all that bullshit. I mean, you know, because all that effort had to amount to something, I felt like. But I guess maybe like the censors, this was like in the early 1960s, so I'm imagining that they wouldn't let murderers get off the hook that easily like that. Incidentally, I read somewhere that the short story by Cornell Woolrich that this was based on, Larry is actually James's teenage son instead of his similarly aged, like middle-aged brother, which would have given the story like a whole different dynamic and maybe made it seem like more harrowing. I mean, not that it isn't harrowing as it is, because the suspense like literally never lets up for a second. But with Larry being an adult, it comes across, at least to me, like more as a black comedy, because he kind of just gets in deeper and deeper, and he just has to keep trying to like stammer and bullshit his way out of every single situation. I mean, at one point, he's even standing there there talking to two acquaintances with the dead woman rolled up in a carpet that's like slung over his shoulder. And he's just like, hey, what's up? Going to the cleaners. I know it's like the middle of the night and that's really weird. And ha ha ha. It's like that. So it's just like kind of like really funny. But that said, this is still like a really entertaining episode, even though it's, you know, kind of, it comes across as like kind of blackly comical, you know what I mean? Considering all the ridiculous hoops that this hapless motherfucker has to jump through just in order to like dump a stiff. But it's still really tense and it's like really, really well plotted. So episode 28 is, I kind of feel like this is one of the better known episodes of the whole entire series, and it's called Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper. So this episode was based on the very popular 1943 short story by Robert Bloch, who obviously wrote Psycho, amid millions of other things. He's a legendary horror writer, suspense writer. Now, this same story was actually also adapted for radio back in 1944, and was also the partial inspiration, I believe, for the episode of the original Star Trek series, which was called Wolf in the Fold. So this episode was actually directed by the very famous actor Ray Milland, who you might know from The Lost Weekend, or Dial M for Murder, or The Premature Burial, like the Roger Corman one, or X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, which is a great underrated horror movie if you haven't seen that. So the story actually uses, obviously, the real Jack the Ripper murders as a jumping off point, I guess, for like a somewhat supernaturally occulty kind of story about Jack the Ripper actually being an immortal who perpetrates all of these killings like on a regular schedule as sacrifices to essentially ensure that he lives forever. I think this concept has maybe been done a bunch of times since then, but as far as I'm aware, it was a pretty new idea back in in the 1940s when the story was written, if not like a completely original idea. So anything that came from, anything with that concept that came after that, I'm pretty sure was like inspired by this story because it was a pretty popular story. So at the beginning of the episode, we have Jack the Ripper completing his, iconic 1888 canonical murders in London. And then the story jumps ahead to the present day of 1961. So a series of homicides that are identical to the Jack the Ripper murders have been taking place in New York City. And you have two kind of cop people, like you have Captain Pete Jago, I think is how you pronounce his last name, and a police psychologist named Dr. Carmody. And they're both on the case, but they are kind of mystified as to why they can't catch this fucking guy. So in their desperation, they agree to listen to the possibly crackpot theories of a Scotland Yard psychologist named Sir Guy, who has been like Sir Man. I don't know why that's so funny to me. But yeah, Sir Guy. So he's been studying the Ripper murders for years and years, and he has become convinced that the same man is responsible for this vast swath of murders that take place every 2 years and 8 months, I think it is. It's like some regular schedule, like I said, in various cities around the world. Like the guy just like hops every 2-3 years. He hops around to different cities, kills a certain number of people, and then kind of like goes to ground again. So the police obviously scoff at this idea. Like, how could the same dude who killed a bunch of women in 1888 also be murdering people in 1961? Because wouldn't he be like fucking 90 years old or something like that? But Sir Guy is pretty insistent that he's like, look, I've really looked into this and there's just no way that there could be another explanation. He also believes that the pattern and the manner of the killings are actually like ritualistic, that they are sort of like offerings to some dark force, and as I mentioned, are designed to maintain the killer's immortality. Now, since Sir Guy is able to accurately predict when the next murder is going to take place, the cops start taking him a little bit more seriously. But because they haven't quite figured out where the killer is going to strike next, because there's a whole thing where the Ripper targets murder sites like, in the shape of a certain symbol, but it's a different symbol every single time, and they don't really know which symbol he's working with this time around. So they know the date, but they don't actually know the location. So multiple women end up getting killed anyway, even though, they've kind of like wised up to what the deal is. Now, because they think that Jack the Ripper might be hiding out amidst the bohemian art community, like in New York City, which was a common thread running all throughout his former series of crimes. I'm guessing that's probably a reference to the actual original Jack the Ripper murders, and one of the suspects for it being Walter Sickert, the painter. even though I don't think he did it, but like, you know what I mean? So I kind of feel like that's where he was going with that. So the cops kind of infiltrate that community and they keep an eye on a bunch of different suspects, including there's this one guy who paints his girlfriend, friend, whoever, with dead flowers on her hair, and then like she turns up dead not too long after that. There's a beatnik with a ridiculous beard who's really into funerals. And there's like this really cranky art critic who just savages everybody's work with, you know, sounding like Oscar Wilde or some shit. The story also kind of teases, this is one where, you know, they're setting up a lot of different suspects. It also teases that maybe Sir Guy himself might be the killer, since he's the one that seems to know so much about the crimes. And the additional possibility that the Ripper might be a woman is also floated at one point. And I admit that that's initially where my mind was going, because I had read this story a long time ago, but I couldn't remember who the killer was. I have to say, though, that the reveal of the killer did genuinely surprise me, though I'm not sure if that's just because I'm a dummy or because this was just a really well plotted story. I'm guessing it's probably like a little bit of both. Now, the best thing about the twist ending that, and this is a spoiler alert, like who the killer is, the killer is actually the police psychologist, Dr. Carmody. He was the killer all along. But the cool thing about it is that that wasn't just a twist for the sake of it. Like, if you go back and watch the episode again and pay attention to all of the interactions that he has with all the other characters, the clues were actually there, like, the whole entire time. So the story was really, it was so skillful at misdirection that the reveal, like, completely threw me for a loop. So that's just great storytelling. You know, Robert Bloch is iconic for a reason. And there's also a reason why this is one of the most beloved episodes of the series. I mean, the acting is great, the suspense is fantastic, and the mystery just keeps you guessing right up until the very end. So episode 29, The Devil's Ticket. This was another episode based on a Robert Bloch story, and this one was also a lot of fun. So we start the proceedings at like a pawn shop, and the proprietor, whose name is Spengler, is in there, and he's like gloating over this big ass pile of money that he has, but he also seems kind of nervous, like he's expecting someone that he doesn't want to see, you know what I mean? And then there's like a little bit of a cat jump scare. Sure enough, though, a couple minutes later, this sinister fellow, you don't really see him at first, it's just like a voice. So he eventually comes calling. He accuses the pawnbroker of being a miser, and then also says, hey, we had a deal type situation. Now, since you know that the episode is called The Devil's Ticket, you can probably guess what that deal entailed. And, you know, so you probably won't be too surprised to know that the pawnbroker gets kind of like pulled into a back room and screams in agony as smoke billows out from under the door. So we then cut to the kind of dump of an apartment of a down-on-his-luck artist named Hector Vane and his wife, Marie. Now, poor Hector has not had a gallery showing in 2 years, and he's actually taken to pawning most of their shit, like, to make ends meet. So, I mean, at the beginning of the episode, they're eating, like, a very sparse dinner of, like, a bowl of soup at a dining room table with no chairs. They're basically just, like, sitting on the floor, which kind of nicely illustrates their poverty, right? Since he's already hawked pretty much everything they own, he decides to take one of his paintings, which is a still life of a pair of old shoes, to the pawn shop that we saw in the episode earlier to see if he can maybe get a couple of bucks for it. So when he gets to Spengler's place, the old pawnbroker is obviously gone, but there's a new guy there. He won't give his name, but it's obviously Satan. And he admires the painting, saying, oh, I really like its realism. He thinks that people should face reality, not like all of these abstract artists with their silly beards and their non-representational bullshit. That's basically what he says. So Mr. Satan does not actually want to buy Hector's painting, but he does offer to give him a deal for his soul. He's like, basically, you can put your soul in hock for a 90-day period. And in exchange, Satan wants Hector to paint him a picture, though at first he doesn't specify exactly what the picture should be of. Now, Hector is obviously, like, pretty reluctant about this, but he's also broke as shit, so he takes the pawn ticket, like, for his soul, not really believing any of this stuff is real. However, as soon as he gets home, his ecstatic wife informs him that, hey, your agent called and managed to get you a one-man showing at this very prestigious, like, uptown gallery. So, obviously, he still doesn't believe that the soul pawning dude was the actual devil. He's pretty happy with how things are turning out. And over the next few weeks, Hector and Marie's life completely changes. Like, his gallery show just goes amazingly. All his paintings sell for just astronomical prices. People start hailing him as an artistic genius, and he basically just starts raking in the cash. So him and Marie just become very, very rich over a very short time period. So him and his wife move into this very swanky mansion with crystal chandeliers and the whole fucking deal. Through it all, though, all of this windfall of money, Hector actually hangs on to his shabby old artist studio and his moth-eaten old overcoat. For the life of her, Marie, his wife, cannot understand why he's doing that. Now, the reason for him keeping the old studio is so that he can meet his mistress, Nadia, there. And the overcoat, you find out why he's keeping that later on. Now, at first, Hector attempts to be slick with this whole deal with the devil. He paints the devil a still life, but the devil is like, nah, I don't want a still life. And then Hector tries to paint him a landscape. Look, it's a really nice landscape. The devil's like, nah, I don't want that either. He basically tells Hector, in fact, he's like, no, I want a portrait. Not only that, whoever you paint the portrait of basically will have their soul burn in hell for eternity in place of Hector's. So as Hector says to the devil, he's like, that's murder. He's like, that's worse than murder because, I'm not only killing them, but their soul is damned forever. And the devil's like, yeah, I'm the devil. Did you not get that memo? Or yeah, it's that. I mean, that does seem like some fine print that maybe should have been disclosed before Hector signed off on the dotted line. But as I mentioned, this is the devil we're talking about here. So I mean, Hector really should have done his due diligence on that whole thing before doing that whole deal. So Hector's kind of freaking out and he doesn't really know what to do. And his mistress, Nadia, who he claims to love much more than he does his wife, is basically threatening to fuck off to Mexico without him if he doesn't leave his wife and marry her instead. So Hector decides that in order to be with Nadia, he's going to use his wife, Marie, as the subject for the devil's portrait, thus killing her and damning her forever, which seems like a little shitty, but whatever. Now, Marie, kind of pathetically, is happy that Hector is finally, paying attention to her again, completely unaware of his ulterior motives. And when he finishes the painting, it's the best thing that he's ever done. But then when Nadia, the mistress, comes to the house and sees it, she gets super pissed that Hector wouldn't paint a portrait of her. Obviously he wouldn't paint a portrait of her because he didn't want to kill her. He wanted to kill his wife. So Nadia also tells him, just by looking at this painting, I can tell that you love your wife way more than you love me. So Nadia, who is not the most mature person, basically slashes up the portrait, ruining it. And she's just like, bye, I'm out of here. And she fucking stomps off. So Hector now has only 48 hours before the devil comes for the painting. If Hector doesn't paint somebody, the devil will take his soul instead to burn for eternity. At last, he gets kind of a devious idea. So 2 days go by, Satan shows up to collect the painting, at which point it's revealed that Hector has actually painted a portrait of the devil, the guy that's playing the devil, you know what I mean? Because he doesn't look like the devil, he just looks like a normal dude, you know what I mean? So, checkmate, devil, gotcha. So Satan seems a little nonplussed by this development. He's never been outsmarted by a mortal before, so he's almost kind of like, oh, all right, fair play, you know what I mean? It does seem like he's going to be a good sport about it and let Hector out of the bargain because he's like, hey, you got me, all right? Nobody did that before. But all he has to do, says the devil, is give me back the pawn ticket for your soul and you're free to go about your life. I don't know if he really would have done that or not, but that's basically what he says. But yeah, remember how I said that Hector didn't want to get rid of that tatty old overcoat that he had? That's because the pawn ticket was in the pocket of the overcoat. And remember earlier in the episode how Marie was always nagging him about why he kept this nasty old coat when he could easily afford a new one. Well, she went out one day and bought him a new one and for some reason burned the old coat and the pawn ticket along with it. Wah, wah. So, yeah. So the devil's like, wah. He's just cackling with glee. And he essentially tells Hector, he's like, women are often Satan's greatest allies. And I was like, are they? All right. I was just kind of somebody that was a little bitter against women wrote this episode. But yeah. So yeah, he ends up Hector. He has his soul taken to the bad place, and because he tried to fool the devil, and it probably would have got away with it if the whole like pawn ticket thing hadn't happened. So this was another really entertaining story. I gotta say, John Emery, the actor, he really crushed it as Satan. He was great. I actually did not foresee that Hector was going to paint the devil's portrait until like a minute before he revealed it, because I was like, oh, I bet he painted the devil. Wouldn't that be funny? Because for a second I thought, did he paint himself? Would that work? I don't really know. So that was actually like a great twist. And then like the whole gut punch about the pawn ticket was also like really, really well set up. Gotta say, like, Robert Bloch was really on fire here. And incidentally, I think this episode was maybe the first time that he had actually adapted his own short story for this particular series. Like, he did the teleplay as well. Obviously, they'd had some episodes prior to this that were based on his short stories, but other people had written the teleplay, but he actually wrote the teleplay for this one too. So episode 30 is called Parasite Mansion. Now, this is another episode directed by Herschel Doherty. This one was actually based on a 1942 short story by Mary Elizabeth Councilman, who is a really prolific author. She published tons and tons of stories in Weird Tales, like back in the 30s and 40s, including one called The Monkey Spoons that I actually read a while back. If you subscribe to my 13 o'clock channel over there, I used to do a series called The Witching Hour, and I used to read like old stories and stuff like that, and that was one of the ones that I read. It's actually like a really good story. So this was another episode that had supernatural elements, so we can kind of definitely see how Thriller was taking more of a turn in the horror direction, though it still had most of the elements of a crime show as well. So at the beginning of the story, the beautiful Marcia, who's actually played by Pippa Scott, who I recognized from her later role in the classic 1974 TV movie Bad Ronald. So yeah, she gets sidelined by a detour, like on this stormy night. And after ending up kind of lost out in the swampy darkness, her car gets shot at and she wrecks, like she hits a tree. So while she's laying there like unconscious at the wheel, there's like this sketchy looking dude and an old woman, and they're kind of like peering in the window at her. So Marcia later wakes up in a bed, clad only in her underwear, and I'm pretty sure that it's low-key, maybe not even low-key, but I think it's low-key implied that somebody like sexually assaulted her or molested her or something like that, and they just kind of like say that, but they don't really go into it to any great degree. So I'm just kind of like, all right, we're just gonna pretend that didn't happen. So yeah, so it turns out that she's been taken in by a strange family, the Herods. Now, the first people she sees are the people that were peering in the car window at her after she wrecked. So you have drunk-ass grown man Victor, who's played by James Griffith, and I immediately recognized him from The Amazing Transparent Man, which was on Mystery Science Theater. He tells her that his kid brother, Rennie, who's played by Tom Nolan, who also played the kid from episode 2 of Thriller, which was called Child's Play, he was the one that shot at her, but it was kind of like a mistake. Then you have the old woman who's just known as Granny, who's just cackling over her, and she informs Marcia that they've gone through all her shit, and they know that she's a teacher at this fancy schmancy boarding school in Shreveport, Louisiana, and that she was going to New Orleans to marry a man, when she got waylaid in the swamp. The pair also tell their little captive there that the mansion does not have a phone and that her car is all busted up so that she can't leave or call for help. Now, even though Marcia has a little bit of a concussion and Victor put some stitches in her head, so probably gave her an infection with his grubby ass fingers, she's not down with this you can't leave bullshit. So as soon as the coast is clear, she puts on her clothes and attempts to sneak the fuck out the house. Unfortunately, the gun-happy kid, Rennie, is posted outside and tries to blow her away the second she sets foot outside the door. The kid misses, luckily, but it's made pretty clear that Rennie doesn't think Marcia should be allowed to leave the mansion alive because she's just like one of those people who came and took his mother away. Now, Marcia, who actually, it's established that she has a degree in psychology and works with children, so she actually has sympathy for the boy who shot at her and uses her knowledge of psychology to kind of like ingratiate herself with Victor, who obviously had a kind of a soft spot for her from the beginning because she's pretty, you know what I mean? She tells Victor that she totally understands why Rennie would be afraid of taken away. However, Victor implies that there's actually much more to fear in this house than just like CPS or whoever like coming to round up the kids for their own protection. Now, later on, Marcia tries to escape again, and during her explorations around this mansion, she finds this kind of hidden room which has a terrified teenage girl in it. Her name is Lolly, and she's played by Beverly Washburn, who is in Old Yeller and was also in Spider Baby, which is a cool movie if you haven't seen it. Lolly is also afraid that Marcia has come to take her to an institution, just like her mother was. But Marcia is actually really kind to her and very empathetic, and Lolly is just, she is pretty like, she chills out. She's like, okay, well, you're obviously an awesome person. Marcia then gives her this jeweled brooch that she has, but very unexpected. Like, seriously, I was just like, wait, what? Like, when this happened? Because she's giving it to her, and then the brooch, like, flies out of her hand and, like, hits the wall, like, by itself. And then blood starts coming out of the girl's arm. So Lolly's freaking out. Granny pops her head into the room, like cackling again, as she usually does. And she's like, oh, he's really mad. And Marcia better shuffle her fancy little behind, like, back to her room before even worse shit happens. So Marcia tries to talk to Victor about what she saw. She's like, hey, you know, the whole blood on Lolly's arm thing, maybe she's exhibiting stigmata, and that's likely because of the excessive fear that you guys are making her live in, and maybe she's, like, really fervently religious. I mean, she believes, in other words, that the whole thing is, like, psychosomatic, you know what I'm saying? Now, Victor's like, yeah, but how do you explain, like, the flying brooch? Marcia kind of tries to come up with a rational explanation. She's like, well, maybe I threw it myself, like, without realizing it. Maybe I had, like, some kind of muscle spasm or some shit like that. Victor is just kind of like, nah, that's not what's going on. You know, that's all your science and shit like that. We've looked into all that stuff. Basically, what it is the Herod family has been cursed with an invisible parasite, hence Parasite Mansion, otherwise known as a poltergeist or a demon, for as long as he can remember. And they're all pretty much afraid what the thing will do if they make it angry, which is why everybody acts so weird around this fucking house. Now, as if to demonstrate this, the demon, or whatever it is, makes a big show of just throwing shit around and, like, abusing the children, and Victor, like, throwing shit at their heads and stuff like that, while everybody is gathered around the table for dinner. Now, Marcia, this freaks her out, obviously, and she's scared, but she's also really sympathetic toward Victor and the kids, and she's just determined to get to the bottom of this fucking mystery. Now, she notes that Granny seems to be the only person in the family who's not scared of the demon and is never hurt by it. Now, later on, Marcia wakes up in her room to find Rennie, the kid, like, standing over her with a knife. Now, she kind of freaks the fuck out a little bit, as you would if you woke up and saw somebody with a knife standing over your bed, you know what I mean? But then Rennie actually, like, kind of lowers the knife and he just starts to cry. He's like, I don't want to kill Marcia, you know, I don't want to kill her. Now, Granny busts in and starts, like, excoriating the kid. It's like, you know, well, I'll just have to do it myself then. And it's revealed, in fact, that the Herods are not cursed by a demon at all. Granny is basically just, like, a telekinetic witch. I guess she's like a witch, but she can, like, move stuff around, like, with her mind and whatnot. And she's been controlling the family for her own gain, I guess, or her own sick amusement, like, ever since she married into this family, like, many, many years ago. Now, in the course of the struggle, like, over where Marcia's trying to get away and somebody's trying to get the knife and everything like that, an oil lamp gets knocked over and basically sets the whole bat on fire. Which I don't know why I thought that was so funny, but I did. So she actually goes screeching out of the house and burns to death in the swamp. So Marcia tells Victor, oh, Granny was the one fucking with you guys all along, and now that she's dead, they can actually live normal lives instead of being just, like, cloistered out here living in mortal fear of a demon all the time. So yeah, this was also a really good episode. It was really spooky, really atmospheric, and the mystery just kept, like, twisting and turning, like, through the whole runtime. Because at first you're thinking, like, well, is there insanity in the family? Or then, oh shit, is there, like, actually a demon or a ghost? Or is somebody, like, playing pranks, or what the fuck is going on? And it just, like, kept changing, so I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, I particularly liked the character of Marcia. I mean, she was intelligent. She was very compassionate. She was very resourceful. And she ended up being like really badass because she single-handedly saved these poor people, this poor family, from their own misery. Like they'd been under the thumb of this cackling old bat like for all of this time, and they didn't realize that that's what it was. So she actually saved them from that. Now, I will say that it was pretty clear, like as soon as the paranormal angle was introduced, you were pretty sure that Granny had something to do with it because she was such an asshole who clearly got so much joy out of watching other people suffer. But I mean, the predictability from that point forward wasn't really a strike against the story because, to be honest, I wasn't actually expecting this to go in a supernatural direction at all at first. Like, I thought it was going to be like the old dark house, you know what I mean? Where there was like some malformed relative or something like that that was locked away in the attic or some shit like that. Because I kind of feel like this story played with those ideas at first, like, you know, what's going on in this house, but then it kind of like subverted them a little bit. I actually think this might have been one of my favorite installments of the series so far. It was one of the most horror forward, I guess. So episode 31 is called A Good Imagination. And this was another episode that was based on a short story by Robert Bloch, who also adapted it for television. He also wrote the teleplay. And it was also directed by John Brom, who also directed several episodes that we've already discussed on previous videos. The Watcher, The Prediction, The Cheaters, The Merryweather File, and Well of Doom, I think were the ones that he has done so far. So we're returning to a more crime-based scenario here too, with a big helping of Edgar Allan Poe, and also a pretty big thread of black humor that I'm pretty sure was intentional this time. So you got a smug book dealer named Frank Logan, who's played by Edward Andrews, who has been in a million things. He was a very famous character actor, but was immediately recognizable to me as Grandpa Howard from the John Hughes movie 16 Candles from the 1980s. I was just like, hey, it's Grandpa. But yeah. So Frank here is getting pretty tired of his wife, Louise, who's actually played by Patricia Barry, who I remember from Kitten with a Whip, which was also on Mystery Science Theater. She's been like screwing around behind his back like pretty much constantly. So he's so tired of this, in fact, that at the beginning of the story, he enters the apartment of his wife's latest boyfriend, whose name is Randy, using the key that he found on Louise's dresser. Now, Frank is actually supposed to be on a business trip out of town, but he uses a fake name to fly home real quick and deal with this matter while still having an alibi of like being in this other town. I mean, and I'm sitting there going, man, remember when you could just like get on a plane giving any old fucking name? You know what I mean? The crap they used to let people get away with, it's like fucking amazing. So Frank horribly murders Randy off screen, using one of Randy's own collection of medieval weapons. I think it was like a hatchet or a mace or something like that. They didn't show it, but he just like took him in another room and did it. Then he stages the whole scene to look like a robbery or like a home invasion gone wrong. And then he flies back to his book dealers conference in, I think it was in Philadelphia, as though he never left. So like I said, he was trying to set up an alibi by using a fake name to fly back and forth. Now, Louise is upset by the loss of her latest bit on the side, but she tries not to look too upset in front of her husband. She's like, yeah, I barely knew the guy, whatever. Yeah, I went to his funeral, but, you know, I just went for a friend. You know what I mean? I didn't know him. I just met him one time. So Frank starts talking to Louise in his very, very condescending manner. He's low-key implying that he might have killed Randy without actually admitting it outright. So Louise is pretty freaked out by this, and she doesn't really want to go to the cops because, one, she doesn't have any proof. I mean, he was just kind of like, he could have just been saying something else. Like, she's like, I don't know if that's what he was actually implying or not. And she's like, plus, if I do go to the cops, then they're going to know that I was fucking around. And it's like, I don't really want my reputation ruined. So she decides what she's going to do instead is she consults her brother about what she should do about it. Now, it so happens that her brother, whose name is Arnold, he knows a private investigator. His name is Joe. So Joe agrees that he's going to go and do some sleuthing around about Frank. So it doesn't take too much legwork to uncover Frank's little secret identity airplane flight. But rather than taking this proof to the authorities saying like, hey, look into this guy because he flew home and then flew back like really quick, Joe actually goes to see Frank personally at this fishing cabin or whatever that he has and tries to blackmail him for $10,000. Not long afterward, Arnold, Louise's brother, also shows up at the cabin. But by the time he gets there, it turns out that Frank has already poisoned Joe And then he also poisons Arnold, and then he puts both their bodies in a fishing boat and like pushes it out into the middle of the lake, like kind of making their deaths look like a horrible accident. Oh, they got like super drunk and they went out boating in the middle of the night and it turned over, and oh, it's too bad, so sad. So Frank is like so sure of his own intelligence because he's such an avid book reader and everything that he just completely keeps his smirking cool like throughout all of these multiple murders. And it actually made me feel a lot sorrier for Louise and more understanding toward her screwing around because, oh boy, is Frank like an insufferable sociopath throughout this whole entire thing. So under the guise of helping Louise recover from the trauma of losing her brother in a boating accident, Frank actually buys this remote house like out in the fucking wilderness and installs Louise out there like without a car so that she can't leave. Like Frank is still working in the city and he only comes to the house on weekends. So she's basically like stuck there. Now, the cabin is filled up with books because, like I said, he's a book dealer, but Louise isn't really much of a reader. So she's afraid that she's going to go out of her mind with boredom being stuck here all the time. But then a hunky local handyman named George, who's actually played by Ed Nelson, who I guess is best known for Peyton Place, but I know him from Night of the Blood Beast because that was on Mystery Science Theater. So he shows up to fix her chimney, if you catch my meaning. No, he actually does show up to fix the chimney because he's like, well, the people that lived here last time, like the chimney was fucked up. So he came to like fix it. But almost immediately, Louise is just kind of like, huh, and she just like latches onto his manly pecs or whatever, and the two of them become entangled, probably stupidly. So they spend pretty much all their time together at the cabin, like during the week when Frank is in the city. Now, of course, Frank suspects what's going on, but like pretends that he doesn't. But he quickly sells the house when his suspicions about the affair are confirmed. After he overhears Louise and George talking about stealing the money from the sale of the house and running off together. So Frank decides to put this diabolical plan that he has into action. This plan entails having George over to do some handyman work, and he's like, I want you to seal off this little section of the basement. So he does that, but it's after it's done, Frank basically tells him, hey, by the way, Louise was trapped in there, Cask of Amontillado style, and guess what? Now you are accessory to the murder, or, you're the one that actually did it because you walled her up. So George freaks out, as you would, and takes off running to tell the cops about this. But Frank is not upset because he was actually counting on that. He was counting on him going to the cops. Turns out that Frank has not actually killed Louise at all. She wasn't behind there. She wasn't in the wall. She was actually in town shopping while all this shit was going on and had no idea what happened. On her way back to the cabin, in fact, the police actually stop her and ask her to identify herself. And she's completely mystified, like, why? What the fuck happened? But they won't tell her. So when she gets home, Frank tells her, oh, George went crazy and told the fuzz that Louise was walled up in the basement. So the cops were just confirming that she was still alive. So Louise is all, I wonder why George would think that. And then, obviously, Frank actually does brick Louise up in the wall now that her living status has been established with the authorities. Like, they've already seen her alive. The whole thing's over. So he's like, well, now I actually can brick you up in the wall. Bye. And he would have gotten away with it, too, if it hadn't been for those meddling, not kids, but, meddling other people. Because the whole plan was actually, and I've seen this plot device done before where it's like, oh, we're going to pretend that we murdered them in this way. But it's like, no, you're crazy. They're already alive. They're alive. They're right here. And that's what he did. But then he's like, oh, I'm actually going to kill you in that manner, like later on, like after the heat has passed. So, but I mean, had it worked, like he would have totally got away with his two-timing wife in a way that was very unlikely to be discovered. And George would just be considered a total nutcase because he insisted the shit happened before it actually happened. So, open and shut. But yeah, you knew that Frank wasn't going to be allowed to get away with this murderous scheming. And in this case, he totally shouldn't get away with it because he was just such an intolerable douche, like during this whole fucking episode. So just as he's putting the finishing touches on the wall, like actually trapping his wife inside, George and the cops like stroll in. And the officers are all like, well, George's police-appointed psychiatrist thought it would help his delusions about the murder if he could actually see Louise alive. So all you have to do is produce your wife. We know she's alive. We just saw her a little while ago. So where's she at? So yeah, Frank glances back at the freshly mortared wall that he just like wall this, and you can almost hear the Price is Right losing horn. But wah wah. It's very much like that. That's like I cracked up when I saw like the look on his face. So this was another really fun episode, especially entertaining for bookworms, because Frank, as annoying as he is, did actually kind of warn people what he was planning by referencing particular books, which of course the victims hadn't read. That was like a big part of the plot. And Frank, I have to say, is actually like a great villain overall, because you just like love to hate him, especially because he thinks he's so much smarter than everyone else, but ends up getting essentially like tripped up by his own supposed cleverness. So I mean, Robert Bloch, like I said, he's just such an amazing writer, but for this particular series, I really think he was just kind of like the gift that kept on giving, you know? So episode 32 is called Mr. George, and this episode is another kind of more crime-oriented one, though it definitely has ghost story elements to it. It also has something of an impressive pedigree. It was directed by the legendary actress, singer, director, writer, producer Ida Lupino. She also actually directed episode 25 of Thriller, which is called Trio for Terror. And this was based on a short story by the equally legendary August Derleth, which he actually wrote under a pseudonym, Stephen Grendon, but it's definitely like August Derleth. If you don't know who that is, he was like a writer in the Lovecraftian vein. And in fact, it was August Derleth who published a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's stuff like after his death, and essentially like made H.P. Lovecraft a household name. So in this story, we're following a little girl named Priscilla, who's actually played by Gina Gillespie, who was in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, among other things. She was actually a child actor. She became a lawyer later on. So this little girl, Priscilla, she still interacts with her family's lawyer, Mr. George, who it was implied was also in a relationship with her widowed mother, and thus was something of like a father figure to her. Now, Mr. George has passed away, as has Priscilla's mom, but since Priscilla still claims to speak to Mr. George on the reg, she doesn't really seem too broken up about his death. There is kind of a big problem, though. The house Priscilla lives in with her relatives, which I'm pretty sure is also the Munsters house, which I guess was on like the Universal backlot or whatever, or the MGM backlot. I can't remember. So the house was actually owned by Priscilla's very rich mother, and the estate is set to go to Priscilla when she comes of age. But obviously she's still a child. She's probably only like 11 or something. So there's been a trust set up by Mr. George and Priscilla's mom, and that trust is being overseen by a judge. Now, this means that Priscilla's adult cousins, whose names are Adelaide, Jared, and Edna, are going to have to make do with a pretty paltry, like, monthly allowance when previously they were used to living high on the hog, I guess, like with Priscilla's mom's money. So all three of them are pretty put out about this, especially when they know that Priscilla's inheritance is worth $500,000. So the very pinched and forbidding Edna isn't even pretending to give a fuck about propriety. She just openly talks to her siblings about, wow, wouldn't it be a shame if some deadly accident were to befall poor little Priscilla? Now, Jared, the brother, he makes a big show of being, appalled by this talk. Oh my God, you're talking about killing a child, blah, blah, blah. But the kind of childlike and I guess like mildly mentally impaired sister Adelaide seems pretty open to the suggestions of her like really conniving sister. Now, Edna does not want any outside witnesses to all her little scheming. However, she's also not willing to do her own dirty work. So she dismisses the housekeeper and then tells Adelaide, the kind of dumb sister, about a case she heard recently whereby a couple of kids suffocated after they hid in an old trunk in the attic and the lid accidentally fell down on them. Hint, hint. She just like tells this story. So Adelaide totally takes the bait, and she lures Priscilla up to their own attic, where she then tells her that Mr. George, who the siblings actually all think is just a figment of Priscilla's imagination, Mr. George is totally hiding in the trunk, and Priscilla should totally crawl into the trunk and check that out. But because Priscilla she's a kid, but she's not an idiot, and because the ghost of Mr. George is absolutely real, he's invisible, but like she can hear his voice, and he's actually like watching out for the kid, he warns her what's going on, And Adelaide actually ends up getting her neck crushed by the trunk lid her own self, which is, a bit of poetic justice. Now, shortly after this, another much less shitty relative, George's sister Laura, comes to visit, ostensibly to express her sympathy for Adelaide's accidental death. Now, Edna and Jared are real assholes to her. Like, I guess they're sort of like projecting their own venality, like, onto this, essentially lovely and pure-hearted woman. And so Laura, like, goes away, but she actually does befriend Priscilla, before she leaves. Now, Laura's brother, George, it turns out, told her all about these three grasping shitheels, like, before he died. So Laura is actually checking up on Priscilla to make sure she's okay, because she doesn't trust these three motherfuckers as far as she can throw them, and, rightly so. So anyway, Edna is pissed that her first plot to kill this kid didn't work out. So the second time, she gets Jared, who I guess wasn't as offended at the idea of offing a child as he initially seemed, to accidentally bash Priscilla in the head with the heavy swing in the front yard. But again, the ghost of Mr. George intervenes, and Jared ends up getting his own head caved in by the swing, which I guess is made of like some really fucking heavy wood. So Laura comes to the house again, not only to convey her condolences for Jared's death. It's like, wow, you guys are dropping like flies over here. But also to very politely tell Edna that the judge who oversees Priscilla's trust has granted Laura custody of Priscilla. So Laura's basically like, well, I'll be coming back. I think it's like the next day to take her away. And just like, I know that you guys aren't really like up with raising kids and stuff. So it's like, this should all work out. And, Edna will still be getting her monthly allowance. They're still letting her live in the house, which you'd think that she would just shut the fuck up about it. And now she doesn't even have to take care of the kid. But oh no, she wants that $500,000. And now that both her siblings are dead, she's like, ooh, now I can have all of it for my own self. So the second Laura leaves, Edna decides, I'm going to take this fucking kid out myself. So she tries to rig it so that when Laura comes back, like the next day to pick the kid up, like the kid will be super excited and she'll rush down the staircase and will trip on this wire that like Edna had planted there. But again, it's Mr. George to the rescue. Because his ghostly voice actually tells Priscilla, hey, you might want to take the back stairs. And Edna ends up tripping over her own trap and like breaking her stupid neck, like at the bottom of the staircase. My favorite thing about this is that Priscilla is so happy to be going with Laura that she just like hightails it out the house, like out the back staircase, and meets Laura at the streetcar outside without even bothering to like go back into the house to say goodbye to Edna or anything. Like neither of them, like Laura doesn't either. She's like, okay, let's go, like getting on the streetcar. So, I mean, the fucking sour old battle axe presumably just lies there and mummifies at the bottom of the staircase, I guess. Which is, that's a fitting end for her, really. So as Priscilla gets on the streetcar with Laura, she hears Mr. George's voice one last time. He's basically like, hey, my work here is done. I was, going to protect you until you were in safe hands. And he's like, and I have to say goodbye now. So Priscilla, she's not all that sad. She's like, I understand, you know what I mean? And the streetcar actually takes her away to her happy new life with George's sister, Laura. So then you see the door to the house, the monster's house, opening and closing by itself, which I guess implies that Mr. George went inside and it's like, is going to haunt the place forever, or that's just where he was going to go to heaven. I don't really know. So this was also a pretty great episode. It's not scary, but it was fun, and it was actually like kind of sweet. I really liked the whole like friendly ghost angle, and it was also really satisfying to see these terrible relatives, get their comeuppance. And Priscilla, the kid, she was actually a really appealing character because she was just this happy-go-lucky little girl. She wasn't really all that aware of how evil her cousins were, but she just went about her life with Mr. George, who she didn't really, I don't know if she really seemed to know. I guess she knew that he was dead. She was like old enough to know that, but it's like, it didn't really upset her that it's like, oh, she's talking to a ghost or nothing like that. I'm going to say too that this episode, and I guess this was Ida Lupino's direction, but it also had a lot of visual interest. Like there were lots of like shots where they're like unusually framed or like, interesting angles and stuff like that. And I think it lent a lot to the storytelling because it wasn't real like staid or stagey. It was kind of like a little bit innovative, you know what I mean? So 6 more episodes down. 35 episodes to go. I am, in fact, almost at the halfway point because I've done 32 episodes and there's 35 left. So I'm almost at the halfway point. So stay tuned for the next 6 sometime. It'll probably be next month sometime. But yeah, hopefully you guys are enjoying this series. These are super fun to do. Like I said, pretty much every episode of this show, if not every single episode, a bunch of them, like the first 26, 27, something like that, are on the Roku channel, but the other ones are on YouTube, like just individually, if you would like to watch them and like follow along. So yeah, that'll do it. Please remember to like and share and comment if you enjoy this content. Please subscribe to Scare Salon if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.